Thank you for the awesome introduction. I'm Ada Rose Cannon from Samsung Internet, where I'm a developer advocate. Before I begin, let's just do the bit I get paid for. Who here has heard of our browser before? A few hands? OK, cool. Of those hands, do any of you test on our browser? OK, cool. So we have a pretty popular browser. Please test on it. We have quite a significant market share. Anyway, that's the bit I get paid for. Time for the fun stuff. So yeah, this talk is a love letter to complexity. Now, this may seem a bit like, oh, complexity is bad. But we work with the web, and the web is incredibly complex. But before I get into that, I'd like to have a bit of story time. So when I was a kid, I used to love assembling these amazing machines. I'd take all the toys from my toy box. I'd get stacks of books, which would fall down like dominoes. They would knock over balls, which would run down pipes. They would make pulleys move and make incredible stuff happen. And this is what we're doing to the web in today. And this is the kind of machine I would be building. So this is an example using the Web Animation API, where I'm just chaining together some animations. So in the web, it's like these machines because we have this complexity. So we have 3 languages in the web, 2 of which are declarative, but they're very different languages. HTML is an XML-like syntax. CSS is based upon a cascade system. Then we have JavaScript, which can come into the mix and ruin all our beautiful declarative stuff at any point in our code. And on top of it, that's not even talking about stuff like the amazing build processes we use to assemble our JavaScript and our CSS. We have incredible pieces of technology to build our backend code, to assemble incredible HTML files and do stuff isomorphically. But today I'm just going to be talking about some of the new toys in our web toy box to build these Rube machines of the web in. So I'm going to talk to you today about CSS Grid, web animations, web components, and CSS Custom Properties. So these are 4 extremely different APIs. So CSS Grid and CSS Custom Properties are CSS-based APIs, which Una went into some detail about in her last talk. Who here was in that talk or saw it? A few of you. The rest of you didn't raise your hands. You seriously missed out. There was an incredible talk. Hopefully, you get a chance to see it again in the future. So we also have web animations, which I'm going to talk about. This is a JavaScript API for doing animation in the web. And finally, web components, which allows us to build our own custom HTML elements. So I have a lot to talk about. I only have about 40 minutes with time for questions to plow into it all. And each of these topics is like a 2-hour topic in their own right. And I'd love to hold you here for 8 hours to go over each of them in detail. But I think they'd drag me off the stage before I get to that point. So without further ado, CSS Grid. So CSS Grid is probably one of my favorite things to land in the web in recent years, which is why I put it first, because I like it the most. CSS Grid is it's a framework for doing 2-dimensional layout in the web. And you don't need anything to work with it. You don't need any kind of framework to go on top of it. You don't need anything like Bootstrap or anything like that. CSS Grid is the framework. So if nothing else, it just saves $250K off your build. But it's so much more than that. It's incredibly powerful and works with all the existing technology of CSS. So this is a very simple grid layout. I've got 3 columns, 200-pixel column on the left, 200-pixel column on the right, and the middle column just takes up the remaining space. For my rows, I've got a 300-pixel header row. My middle row fills the available space, and my footer row is just the smallest it can be. Then I've told my header to go into my first row and fill 3 columns. This is a very minimalist example. Grid is incredibly powerful and provides syntax for describing really impressive layouts in a short space of time. And the nice thing about it, it works very well with how designers think about designing your pages. You can, as well as intentionally placing objects into your grid and having them fit into your layout, it also allows you to intentionally not place stuff in your grid, to use Whitespace effectively. So instead of having all the content, as it is by default, crammed up just to near the top of the page as possible, we can produce beautiful layouts in which the user's eye has plenty of space to rest and the content is very legible. One of the really nice features of it is that, one of the really nice effects it has on the web is that it allows us to remove the elements we would have for displays. For example, these two divs in my example, which are style display flex, they are not semantic elements. They're not providing additional information to the user. They're nothing to me as a developer. They're just some dirty hack I've done to make sure these elements stay in a row. So with CSS Grid, because that information is now in the CSS where it's supposed to be, we now have very beautiful semantic HTML. Its power comes from that it allows us to define the layouts and put the content into the layout. Because previously, our designers would give us these beautiful layouts they designed, and then we would try and hack our content to fit into that layout, but by working out how it related to each other, not how it related to the layout as a whole. So if you find that building CSS for you is kind of like this, where you're constantly fiddling with it, and every time you change something, something else breaks, then CSS Grid is probably the answer you're looking for. I love this quote from Jeremy Keith. He's an amazing developer who hadn't tackled CSS Grid before, and he was looking to produce a really complex layout. He'd left it really late in his development for his build because he knew it would be a really difficult thing to produce. So he'd set aside a full half day to really get on and crack and force his elements to match this layout he designed. But he used CSS Grid, and he was done in 5 minutes. And he wasn't exaggerating. He literally started, and before his tea was cold, he'd finished making his layout, and then had an entire half day to carry on adding features, which is really nice. And it stops us worrying about CSS so much because we separate our layout from our displays. So we have our content which we can display as we want, and we don't have to worry about it breaking our layout so much because our layout is handled by CSS Grid. So next topic, jumping to an entirely different part of the stack, web animations. So the web animation API is a JavaScript API for doing animations in the web. So previously, like animations in the web, they aren't new. There's JavaScript libraries for doing it, and we've been able to do it in CSS for a long time now using CSS animations and CSS transitions. But unfortunately, by doing it in the CSS route, we often want to tie our animations to respond to some user interaction, or we want to wait for the animation to finish until we move on with the next stage of our app. Instead of just setting a timeout, we want to be able to actually respond to stuff finishing. And the Web Animation API looks to solve some of these problems. So the API is actually pretty simple looking. So, but it has a lot of in-depth and complexity to it, which we can learn if you study it more. But here we have a bool, and I have a keyframes object, which I'll explain in a sec, and a keyframe options object, which I'll explain in another sec. So it's just an animate method with 2 objects that go into it. The keyframes are a list of properties, or they're a list of properties a list of property maps which change because they go down the list, as in the first one, or they are a map of properties where it goes across the array and animates each one, which is the second example. So these two both do the same thing, where it goes from transform translate y is 0 to minus 80 vertical height units. I personally prefer the top, but they're both correct. They're both the same. Whichever works well for you, really. So the animation for this, the result is pretty minimalistic. It does the animation and resets to its original position. The duration object in the bottom is the options object from the previous slide. It's got lots of properties we can do with it, so make it animate twice. I can make it go forward and backwards. And I can give it some kind of easing function so that it behaves in a way that feels more natural to the users rather than these really gross linear animations. So this feels just like a bit more natural. One thing that's really nice is being able to use it with asynchronous JavaScript. So has anyone seen like this kind of syntax before? Oh, no. OK, this is awesome. So I'm about to show you something super, super cool that comes in like ES 2015. So asynchronous functions. Is anyone here, are you familiar with promises? Like, show me hands. OK, good. That's good base level. The animate function has a finished attribute. And this attribute is a promise. And if you use asynchronous functions, you can await for promises to finish before it moves on. This allows you to write asynchronous code synchronously, which is super cool, and I hope you use it for all kinds of things. But it's really nice in this particular example because it allows us to chain elements. So here, I'm animating an element, and then I'm going into a for loop. But this for loop is like a synchronous for loop. But because it's asynchronous, because the async keyword, and it's got the await after each one, it animates one of the elements, waits for it to finish before it animates the next one, which is really, really nice. So this example here is literally just a copy and pasted code snippet from how I animated the dominoes in my slide from, whoa, about 10 minutes ago. Oh my God, this is going quick. OK, right, let's shift it up a bit. Yeah, I've got a lot to talk about. Web components. So yeah, web components are super cool. You can define your own HTML elements because we know what we want better than the people who write the HTML standard. That was a joke. Thank you for laughing. I appreciate it. So yeah, we can build our own HTML elements, which is really cool. They're really powerful. We can hook into all kinds of stuff. There is one restriction. New HTML elements have to have a dash in the name. So my dash car, beautiful dash pony, pretty dash button, brilliant dash modal, whatever you want to build, stupid dash thing. Just make something, give it a fun name. If you're already boring, you can be like my company dash modal, my company dash spaghetti or whatever. If you're already boring, but use adjectives, they're fun. Just and have fun with it. Yeah, so what do? Shadow DOM. The Shadow DOM is like the secret sauce of web components. It's why everyone really likes them. There's a bit more to it than like just Shadow DOM, but this is like the really cool bit. So the Shadow DOM allows you to put elements into this Shadow DOM, which is like a child of your element. But when they're in there, they're hidden from the rest of the document. And not only that, if you have styling in, yeah, I missed a point. Yeah, so if you hide stuff in the elements, it allows you to hide any elements you'd have, which you're just using for appearance. So who here is guilty of having too many divs and spans in their code? Be honest. Yeah, right? So this allows us to kind of hide those inside the elements we're building. They're not, so our HTML looks really beautiful, and we get rid of like the div soup we've got. Like we end up with markup that makes a lot more sense because we just see the elements that we've defined. And what's really nice is that the document itself can't interact with the styling of your elements. And they're not only, so the document, so if you set like a color on H1s in your document, the color of H1s in your element will just be the default color. They're not going to be overridden from the outside. So that's pretty cool. But not only that, any style tags you have inside your component or any style sheets you bring in with a link tag, they are encapsulated within your element. So you can write really dumb-looking CSS where you've just got div do this, span do that. CSS you would never normally write because you would worry about clashing with other selectors. You can do it in web components because they're encapsulated in the component. So if you only have 6 elements in there, you can just style it however you want and don't have to worry about breaking other people's code in your team. They also have JavaScript callbacks. So you can hook into the lifecycle of the element so that when it gets added to the document, you can respond to that. When attributes get changed, you can respond to that as well. And you can react to it being removed from the document. And this is really powerful because it allows you to build elements that behave just like normal HTML elements would and tidy up after themselves. And because they're just normal HTML elements, you can start to use them like Lego bricks and place them around. And this allows them to be used with any kind of framework or library. So you can, so I know you're already super psyched about web components now. And you're probably going to go home and you're going to be like, right, screw React, screw Angular, don't need that anymore. I'm just going to use web components because they're awesome. Well, you don't need to do that. You can replace bits of your old app bit by bit. So if you're like, I've got a piece of functionality that can be really neatly encapsulated into a web component, then you can take out that bit of element, take out that functionality, put it into a web component, and because it's normal, ordinary, bog-standard HTML, it'll work with your whatever weird library or framework you're using, because that uses HTML. Like HTML is the lower level of the web which we're building with. It's like our render target. It'll just work with that too. So whether you're using normal HTML or some magic framework, it's going to work. And I think that's really neat because it means we can tidy up our code bit by bit and make our frameworks make a lot more sense. Right, CSS Custom Properties. These are really cool. And so part of this talk is showing you how all these things work together. And CSS Custom Properties are so useful. A lot of them actually involve CSS Custom Properties because they're just very useful. So at the most primitive level, you can think of them as like, oh, they're variables for my style sheet. And yes, you can use them like that. And it's a very effective way to do it. So here I've defined my color cyan, which is the color in the top right corner of my slides. And I can use it on my background or in your gradient in the case of these slides. Oh, yeah, everything I talk about today, I actually implement in the source code of my slide deck. So if you're really curious, I'll tweet out the source code to my slides later, and you can take a look. So yeah, color cyan, yeah. So it makes sense that when we read through our code later, we're like, oh, the background is the cyan color, regardless of what that is, even if the cyan color is actually red. It even works with calculated attributes. So you can do really intelligent stuff with them. You can combine variables together. You can make them work in really interesting ways. And there's a lot of power that can be got here and stuff where I'm like, oh, no, this is going to be impossible. And then I'm like, oh, I've done it in a CSS one-liner rather than falling back to JavaScript or something weird like I might have done before. CSS one-liner, that sounds like a weird thing. But that is the thing now. Like, CSS is getting really smart and powerful. Like, it's fun. And the nice thing, which I really like, and if you really appreciate CSS, is that it works within the cascade. So if you know the order of like how they're going to override each other, which you should do if you're working with CSS frequently. You can have stuff so that it behaves accordingly in a way we expect. So in this example, the root of my document, I've set the padding to 5 pixels, like that's the padding variable, the padding custom property, sorry. But under main, the custom property is set to 3 pixels. So p tags, which are outside of my main element, will have a margin of, fast math, 25 pixels. That took me far too long for 5 times 5. P elements inside my main tag will have a margin of 15 pixels. So these are just like super boring demos. I'm sure you'll do something much more interesting with them. And that's the basic coverage of the elements of the new APIs I'm going to talk about. I'm now going to start discussing about how these APIs can interact with each other in interesting ways. Oh, no, I'm not. This is something new and cool in my slide deck. So I shouldn't edit my slide deck literally moments before I step on the stage. So this is something I've been thinking about recently, and it makes responsive design in CSS incredibly beautiful. So by default, for our mobile-first layout, I've set the padding to 5 pixels. On larger screens, the padding is 15 pixels, and on desktops, I've set it to 30 pixels. But if you give yourself a rule of, in my media queries, I will only change my custom properties, your media queries become incredibly explicit. So you can look through your media query and be like, I can see exactly what is changing, and without having to worry about interacting with changing something where you're not actually sure why something has been changed. It has nicely labeled custom properties and makes more sense. So yeah, next thing I'm going to talk about, how web components work with custom properties. So when I said earlier that the DOM that styles in like the normal web page don't affect what's in the shadow DOM, that was a total lie, I'm sorry. What some things can go through, one of which, not lots, but very few things, one of which is custom properties. So this means that if I define a custom property in my page, then I can use it again in my custom element. But this may seem like a really terrible idea, because you'll be like, well, then that means my custom element is tightly coupled to my page. We don't want that. And that's true. That's a bad idea. So what you can do, you can set the variable again in your style sheet, in your shadow DOM, so that it actually has a value. And you can use it again, and you're not coupled to the page. But if we still want to be able to control that custom property from outside of our element, we can still do that. Because I've set it onto the host selector, the host selector of my custom element, I can override that by setting styles on my element itself. So here I've overridden the custom property on my custom element, and now I can have effect in my element itself. But no one likes doing inline styles. It's not as performant. It's a bit hacky. But fortunately, this also works if you just set it in the style sheet as well. So for this page, custom elements have their margin set to 20 pixels, which I think that's really cool. But when you think about it bigger, when you think about it, I could set any property I want to be user configurable as custom properties in my custom element. I can start building custom elements which can be themed according to the page. So if you are a company that has hundreds of thousands of websites, but each one themed differently for each client, you can build your custom elements which have all their amazing logic and power in them. and then ship a style sheet which configures how those custom properties are set on each page. So one company might have the margin set to 5 pixels, have the primary color set to blue. Another might have the margin size set to 30 pixels and the primary color set to lavender blush. And you can, I mean, this is like a super primitive example, but this works for all properties. So you could make something where the look is entirely different between two web pages which are using the same element. And you can build a suite of components which even share the same custom property names. And you could build yourself a framework of elements which work across all your sites and are themed according to the brand of each site, which feels like a very powerful pattern to me. Next topic, CSS Grid and Web Components. So these go together like cheese and crackers, like they're beautiful combination. So here we have, like in our old-fashioned style HTML, we have a div with the class of head, with a header in it so that it's placed at the top. We have a left column and some kind of widget I've made out of elements. This is a simpler example. But you can imagine how complex these kinds of layouts can get when you have both elements for layout and elements for appearance. Well, if you bring in CSS Grid, we remove all of our elements which are required for layout. We start using custom properties, and we start removing the elements we have which are just for appearance. And then when we bring down our HTML file, we end up with a HTML file where everything in there is semantic. We have our header, which means something in the layout of the document. We have our H1, which has our title in it. We have our widget, which is something we've defined ourselves and has meaning to us as developers. And then we have our main tag and our paragraph content. But what's beautiful about this is that our HTML file is now our source of truth. We don't have to ship down some giant JSON file and then build it on the client. The HTML now contains the configuration data of our app. We've defined it in the HTML, which can often end up being smaller than shipping just a big blob of data. It's also faster to parse, and it works and falls back beautifully. So we end up building websites in a way that feels like it's 1992, in that it's very simple and very quick to deploy. But we end up with the power and robustness of building a website in 2018. It's just beautiful. So I love HTML so much. It's by far my favorite programming language. Yes, it is a language. It has language in the name, therefore it counts. HTML is really cool. It's my favorite. And when you end up with this pattern of just combining grid and custom properties, yeah, it makes it look good. Like, if you look through the source code of my slides, you can just read the source code and be like, oh, yeah, I can see what's going on here. It kind of makes sense. Like, together, it brings clarity to complexity, because our websites are complex. There's a lot going on. But by combining these two elements, we've hidden away the bits that are scary and difficult, which we probably don't need to play with change all that much. And it's really nice. Sorry, I love HTML. Right, CSS Grid and custom properties. So this is a pretty cool combination. So, oh, that's too small. Oh yeah, I'll explain to you what's happening, because there's actually a lot of code on the next slide. That's why it's so small. So here I've got I have defined my template using the repeat method in CSS. And I'm using the grid columns custom property to set the number of columns I have. And then in my media query for mobile screens, I'm saying this should now be one column. So this is the pattern I described earlier, where you only change your custom properties in the media query. And it makes stuff make a lot more sense. Because if I had to write the full grid template columns definition, I wouldn't know how I had changed it had actually made a difference to the program. Whereas what I know now is that, it's just an announcement. So what I know now is that what I've done on small screens, the number of columns I have in my grid is 1. So here I have a pretty complex layout for a web app I'm building at home, because I do this for fun. I talk about VR stuff usually. So here I have 2 quite complex layouts I've described using CSS Grid, layout big and layout small. And I don't want to have to copy and paste these big chunks of complex. All those 5 lines is one attribute. So it's quite complex. I don't want to have to copy and paste that throughout my CSS file at random points. So I have it defined at the top of my document where I can see it and edit it and kind of forget about it. Because when I want to reuse it, I just refer to it by its variable. And then on larger screens, I can use the layout big. And I know what's happening because it's using layout big. Now, in this case, I'm changing grid template directly. But if you wanted to use the pattern where you only change the custom properties, you could also do something like custom property current layout is layout small, and then in my media query, I change current layout to var layout big. So that's another thing you could do, but I just kept it a bit simpler here. All right, so custom properties and web animations. So this one is pretty neat and really powerful. So in my opinion, and I think it's a correct opinion, as all opinions are, that easing functions should be kept in the style sheet because they're part of your styling. So my easing library is a CSS file which contains 15 easing functions. No, actually more than that, 24 easing functions now, which I can reuse again and again in my CSS by going, if I have a transition, use var easing cubic for the easing function. But I introduced the web animation API earlier, which is a JavaScript API. Fortunately, you can still access CSS variables. CSS custom I shouldn't stop calling them that. CSS custom properties from JavaScript. So you can use getComputedStyle and then .getPropertyValue to find out what the value is. And what's really nice with this is that if I'm updating my CSS values dynamically, I can make use of them, and I don't have to copy any logic into my function. So if I had a different easing function for different screen sizes, I don't have to duplicate that logic using media queries in JavaScript. I can have all my media query logic in the CSS where it belongs. And I can refer to my custom properties from JavaScript to work out, to tell me how stuff should behave. So CSS tells me how stuff should react on a moment-by-moment basis. So here in this example, I have an animation that gets eased out cubic, which is a pretty normal one. You can also use it with other kind of media queries. So here I've given myself a duration factor custom property. So by default, it's just as a normal animation. If the user has set some kind of configuration option to set slow animations in my app, then I can set duration factor to 2. And if the browser prefers reduced motion, I can disable my animations altogether. When I use them, I can then use get property value duration factor to tell me what the duration should now be. And if these changes happen on the fly, the CSS will get updated, and I will recalculate the get computed style and get the correct value so that all my animations can respond to stuff changing without actually needing to reload the page or regenerate a new JavaScript file or anything weird like that. It just kind of works pretty nicely. It would be really nice if we could do this. If we could just animate our custom properties directly. I mean, that would be really nice, because then we could have a custom property that affects many things and animate it accordingly. Oh, just a heads up, if you're animating stuff like this, with the Web Animation API, you still have to pay attention to what's going to cause a reflow of your page or a repaint. Isn't some magic cure-all for stuff like that. So try and animate stuff like opacity and transforms as opposed to widths, heights, and lefts and stuff. Anyway, back to where I was. So yeah, it'd be really nice if I could do this, because then I could have many elements that listen to X coordinate and Y coordinate, and have them all animated by a single property. Well, this is something which we can kind of do now in one browser or maybe two browsers. It's just super bleeding edge stuff. The Houdini, is Houdini ready yet? Is my homepage on my laptop, because I just love seeing it every day, and I'm just waiting to try out this stuff on other browsers. But yeah, you can animate custom properties if you tell the browser how they should be handled. So it might be a length, or it might be a color, or it could, I can't remember other types on the fly, but it could be any kind of thing. And if you tell the browser what it is, it knows how to animate it. So it knows that it animates lengths by making them longer, for example. So in this case, I know X coordinate is a length, and if I register this property, and same for the Y coordinate, when I animate it with web animations, it will animate smoothly, and that's really nice. If you saw Una's talk, the last one, she had an amazing example of animating a gradient using this, and it looked stunning. And this stuff is it's the future. So if you're not already in love with CSS, start loving it soon, because it's getting really powerful, and it will save you a lot of headache. And all the stuff I've talked about today is stuff you can start using already. In the case of Grid, it's just usable now. Use it. Custom properties are also pretty usable. Web animations and custom elements both have a very, very excellent polyfill. So for the few browsers that don't support them already. So you can start playing with stuff today, and I really recommend it. Anyway, I'd like to say thank you for listening. Please go out and build Rube Goldberg machines of your own, mix these APIs, try using them together, learn how to use them. As I said earlier, I would have liked to have had 2 hours per topic to go in each of these. They're going to take a while to find out what the really powerful patterns are, and I hope I've shown you a few today. Thank you.
Thank you, Ada. That was wonderful. So you have some questions here.
Cool.
The audience would like to know, what is the fallback solution for browsers which don't support CSS Grid?
This is a good question. So people much smarter than me have written guides on the appropriate Flexbox solution you can have. Una's written a tool, which I can't remember the URL off the top of my head. If she's here in the audience, can you tweet that out and so people can find it? I think it was Grid to Flex or something. It allows you to enter your grid layout, and it gives you an appropriate Flexbox fallback for older browsers. And you can write your own Flexbox fallback if you want. And it's pretty OK if your Flexbox fallback is actually a simple one. So if they just get a single column layout, if grid's not supported, that's pretty OK, because grid support is really high these days. So yeah, progressive enhancement all the way.
Cool. How do screen readers or other robots handle web components?
So this is actually a really cool question. I've heard before, I can't tell for sure, that they don't run the JavaScript, so they don't see what's inside your shadow DOM, which is totally fine, because if you're putting content in your shadow DOM, you're not really doing web components right. For example, if you have a web component which plays audio somehow, or even like an audio player web component, make sure the audio tag is still available inside the slots of your shadow DOM, so that when custom elements don't work, the actual raw content is still there, so you don't lose your text, your media data, so it shouldn't break your SEO.
Awesome. OK. So they want to know, what's the benefit to using CSS Custom Properties when there's SAS?
CSS Custom Properties work in the browser. If you compile something with SAS, it can't know beforehand what units you're using, and because they're different in the browser. Like, it can't compare an EM to a pixel. Whereas custom properties, yeah, the browser knows how big an EM is. It knows how big a pixel is. So you can mix units. You can also take advantage of the cascade, because stuff calculates dynamically. You can also update them dynamically using JavaScript. There's huge advantages to using them. I mean, sure, if you want, you can also use web components within SAS. Like, they're not mutually exclusive technologies. So if you like how SAS does its nested selectors, you could use a combination of SAS's nested selectors with custom properties if you want. I personally, now I've started using CSS properties and CSS Grid more. I found it simplified my CSS enough that I don't need SAS anymore. It stopped being like, it's like a crutch I no longer need. I just type out a CSS file.
So speaking of nesting, do you think there will be CSS code nesting in the future?
Oh, see, that would be really, I would like that, but I don't think so. I personally would like it, though.
So what about CSS Grid and browser compatibility?
Yeah, it's actually really good. All the browsers kind of scheme together behind the scenes of like, we're going to get this out at once and get everyone really excited about it. So support went from like 0 to like 75% in like March 2017. And it just went boom, here's Grid as a present for you. Samsung Internet, we came a little bit later, like 2 or 3 months later, but we have it in our browser as well. Yeah, browser compatibility is really good. And where it's not available, progressive enhancement, give it a Flexbox fallback so that it works in all the browsers.
So IE is still not supporting a lot of these. Do you use these in production?
I'm a developer advocate, unfortunately, so I have no code in production anymore. But what I would say is if you want to use the stuff in production, use it in production. We wouldn't put it in browsers if you weren't supposed to use it, and we won't know how popular it is if you don't use it. Like, it's progressive enhancement, progressive enhancement, progressive enhancement. You should always have a sensible fallback for when stuff doesn't work, or features have been turned off by the user, or it's simply on a format which it doesn't work for. So provide a progressive enhanced fallback so it works. Like, use it in production. The supports will surprise you.
Awesome. One last question. Can I use a custom CSS property in a component and not allow it to be set by the host, kind of like a private property?
Yeah, you could, instead of putting it in :host, just put it in one of the subselectors, and then it won't be able to override it. Yeah. So instead of being like :host, just do like p -- or main -- or whatever whatever you've got in your shadow DOM, you can just use it there. Just don't use it in the host, because that's where it can be overridden.
Awesome. Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Ada. That's all the questions we have time for. Let's give her a round of applause.